Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberly, an intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. Today, we're going to talk about something that brings a lot of relief when it's finally named. The fact that grief doesn't come in just one shape. There isn't one correct way to grieve. There isn't one timeline, and there isn't one emotional experience that defines it. There are many kinds of grief, and often we carry more than one at the same time. Some of these terms we'll talk about today come from clinical psychology. Others are descriptive ways people have tried to name what grief can look like. None of them are meant to label you. They are meant to help you recognize yourself. As you listen, you don't need to figure anything out. Just notice what resonates today. There's a type of grief that often gets referred to as uncomplicated grief. And I want to pause here because the name itself can feel extremely misleading. Uncomplicated grief doesn't mean easy. It doesn't mean painless. It doesn't mean you loved less. What it usually means is that the loss, while still deeply painful, fits more closely into what our culture expects grief to look like. This kind of grief often follows a loss where the relationship felt relatively secure, where there were fewer unresolved conflicts, or the death made sense within the context of illness or age. There was space to mourn openly and receive support. In uncomplicated grief, people may still cry deeply. They may still ache. They may miss the person every day. But over time, their grief tends to soften and integrate rather than fragment. There's often sadness without constant shock, longing without disorientation, memory without overwhelm, or pain that comes in waves instead of floods. People experiencing uncomplicated grief may find they can talk about the person without shutting down. They can hold both loss and connection at the same time. And that life gradually reorganizes itself around the absence. And that doesn't make their grief better than anyone else's. It makes it less complicated by trauma, secrecy, or unresolved layers. It's important to say this out loud because many people compare themselves to someone grieving this way and they think, why don't I look like that? Why isn't my grief moving the same way? Often the difference isn't strength, it's context. When grief becomes complicated, prolonged, or overwhelming, it's rarely because someone is grieving incorrectly. It's because there are additional layers, trauma, conflict, suddenness, responsibility, identity loss, or lack of support. So if uncomplicated grief doesn't sound like your experience, that doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means your grief had more to carry. Another type of grief is anticipatory grief, and this is the grief that begins before a loss occurs. It happens when you know, intellectually or intuitively, that something is changing, ending, or slipping away, even while the person is still here. This kind of grief often shows up during serious illness, progressive decline, or prolonged uncertainty. And it can be one of the most confusing forms of grief because you're grieving while still loving, caring, hoping, and showing up. When someone you love is sick, you may not have the language for what is happening inside of you at the time. You're still the person who loves them in the same role as before. You're still advocating, still believing in possibilities, and at the same time, your body may have known something that your mind couldn't hold yet. There's grief living alongside hope. There's fear alongside tenderness, preparation alongside denial. You grieve them in moments when you notice how tired they are, when things become harder for them, when you realize certain futures are quietly closing. And then you might feel guilty for that grief because they're still alive. Because loving someone who is still here can make anticipatory grief feel like a betrayal. As if noticing the loss ahead of time means you're giving up. But anticipatory grief isn't giving up. It's your nervous system responding to reality before your heart is ready to name it. It can look like deep sadness that comes and goes without explanation, sudden waves of panic or dread, irritability mixed with fierce protectiveness, moments of emotional numbness followed by intense attachment, a sense of living in two timelines at once, now and after. For parents, anticipatory grief can be especially isolating. You may be praised for being strong, for holding it together, for doing so well. Meanwhile, inside, you're quietly mourning milestones that haven't even been missed yet while still showing up fully in the present. There's also a unique exhaustion that comes with anticipatory grief. You are grieving, you're caregiving, you're hoping, you're bracing, all at the same time. And because the loss hasn't happened yet, people often don't recognize this as grief at all. They often say things like, stay positive, don't think that way, or you don't know what will happen, which can leave you feeling unseen, as though your grief has no place to land. But anticipatory grief is not premature grief, it's protective grief. It's the psyche and the body beginning to adapt to reality that feels unthinkable, not because you want it to happen, but because love is already responding to what it senses. And when the loss does eventually occur, many people are surprised to find that grief doesn't start then. It deepens, it changes, it takes a different shape, but it doesn't begin at the moment of death. It began long before. In the quiet moments, the hospital rooms, the long nights, the things you noticed but didn't say out loud. That's why anticipatory grief can complicate later grief. You're not only grieving the loss itself, you're also grieving the months or years you spent bracing, hoping, and loving in survival mode. So if you recognize yourself here, if you find yourself grieving someone who's still alive, or grieving a future you can already feel slipping away, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not doing grief wrong. You are responding to love under impossible circumstances, and that kind of grief deserves tenderness, not silence, not correction, not shame. Anticipatory grief prepares us in some ways, but it doesn't make us immune, because not all loss gives us time. Some grief arrives without warning, without preparation, without the slow bracing that anticipatory grief brings. And when grief comes suddenly or through trauma, the body and the nervous system are asked to process not only loss, but shock. Traumatic grief happens when loss is paired with shock, fear, or a sense of danger, when the nervous system doesn't just register sadness, but threat. It's not only about who was lost, it's about how they were lost. Traumatic grief often follows things like sudden accidents, violence, disasters, medical emergencies, or events where there was chaos, unanswered questions, or lack of control. And what makes traumatic grief different is that the body remembers the moment, sometimes more vividly than the person themselves. With traumatic grief, people often say, I can't stop replaying it. I feel on edge all the time. Or I don't just miss them, I'm stuck in how it happened. That's because traumatic grief lives in the nervous system, not just the heart. For me, this showed up with my mom. My mom died in a house fire. And even saying that out loud carries weight because fires aren't quiet losses. They're sudden. They're violent. They leave behind unanswered questions and imagery that the mind wasn't meant to hold. What made this grief complicated was that I didn't just grieve my mom, I grieved the way she died, the shock, the disbelief, the horror of knowing she was there and I wasn't. And layered into that was something else that people don't always name. My mom was an alcoholic, which meant that in many ways I had already been grieving her while she was still alive. I grieved the version of her that couldn't be present. I grieved the instability. I grieved the hope that things would one day be different. So when she died, the grief wasn't singular, it was layered. There was love, there was anger, there was relief, there was guilt for feeling relief, there was sadness for what never got resolved, there was trauma for how it happened, and grief for the mother she couldn't be. This is something traumatic grief often does. It pulls everything unfinished to the surface at once. People with traumatic grief may experience intrusive thoughts or images, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, sudden waves of panic or anger, or a sense of being unsafe even when life is calm. And often they feel confused about why they're reacting this way. They may tell themselves, it's been years, I should be past this. But traumatic grief doesn't follow timelines, it follows the nervous system. When loss happens through trauma, the body learns something terrible can happen without warning. And until that belief is gently challenged through safety, support, and time, the body stays alert. Another thing that often gets missed with traumatic grief is this. People don't always know how to support it. They may avoid asking questions. They may rush you toward forgiveness or meaning. They may minimize the impact because the details make them uncomfortable. But traumatic grief doesn't need fixing. It needs containment. It needs space where the story doesn't have to be rushed or explained away or cleaned up to make other people feel better. And it needs permission to exist alongside other kinds of grief. Because traumatic grief rarely shows up alone. It often overlaps with anticipatory grief, complicated grief, cumulative grief, or even disenfranchised grief. If you're listening and parts of this resonate, if your grief feels tangled with fear, shock, or unresolved questions, I want you to hear this clearly. Your reaction makes sense. Your body is not broken. Your grief is not excessive, and you are not weak for still carrying this. Traumatic grief isn't something you get over. It's something that slowly learns it's safe to loosen its grip. And that process takes time, gentleness, and a kind of support that doesn't ask you to rush. The next type of grief I want to mention is inhibited grief. This happens when grief is present but blocked. Not because the person doesn't care, not because the loss didn't matter, but because the grief didn't feel allowed. Inhibited grief often develops when you're placed in a role where others need you to stay functional, where there's pressure to be strong, or you're expected to manage logistics instead of emotions. Maybe even the environment doesn't feel safe to fall apart. Inhibited grief isn't loud, it's contained, controlled, often mistaken for resilience. People with inhibited grief often hear, "You're handling this so well, I don't know how you're doing it, you're so strong." And on the outside, that may look true, but on the inside, something gets delayed. For me, this showed up very clearly with my grandmother. My grandmother collapsed while I was out of town. She was put on life support. And suddenly, without being asked, I was placed in charge. Decisions, updates, responsibility. There wasn't space to feel. There wasn't time to process. There was just a job to do. So I did what many people do in moments like that. I shut something down. Not consciously, not intentionally, but automatically. My nervous system went into management mode, and that's what inhibited grief often looks like. Grief gets postponed because survival takes over. You're not denying the loss, you're compartmentalizing it. You tell yourself, "I'll deal with this later," or "there will be time to feel. Right now, I just need to get through this." But grief doesn't disappear when it's postponed, it waits. And inhibited grief often shows up later as emotional numbness or sudden exhaustion after the crisis passes. Maybe delayed waves of sadness that feel confusing, or irritability or shutdown. Even physical symptoms with no clear explanation. People might even wonder, why is this hitting me now? I thought I already dealt with this. But what changed is safety. Inhibited grief waits until the body senses it's no longer required to perform. And this kind of grief is especially common in people who are caretakers, who are oldest siblings, who are used to being the responsible one, or who are relied on emotionally by others. It's also common when grief happens publicly, when there are hospitals, meetings, decisions, family dynamics, because there's very little room to be human. One of the hardest parts of inhibited grief is that people don't always recognize it as grief because there were no tears, no collapse, no obvious breakdown. But absence of expression is not absence of pain. It just means the grief didn't have permission yet. It's a delayed response to overwhelm. It doesn't need judgment, it needs gentleness. If you recognize yourself here, if you were the one holding things together while your own heart stayed quiet, I want you to hear this. Your grief didn't disappear, it was waiting for safety. And when it arrived later, it didn't mean you were falling apart, it means you're finally allowed to feel. Another type of grief is disenfranchised grief, and it's one of the most painful forms of grief, not because the loss is greater, but because the grief is often unrecognized. It's the kind of grief that doesn't receive permission. There's no card for it, no script, no socially agreed upon way to show up with it. Disenfranchised grief happens when the world around you subtly or overtly tells you your loss didn't quite count. Sometimes it sounds like you weren't even that close, or you should be over this by now. Or why are you still talking about this? And sometimes no one says anything at all, which can hurt even more. This kind of grief often lives in silence, not because the pain is small, but because there's nowhere safe to place it. Disenfranchised grief also shows up when the relationship itself was complicated, when there was love and harm, attachment and distance, relief and sorrow existing at the same time. There isn't a socially acceptable box for that, so people learn to edit their grief. They tone it down. They make it more palatable or explain it or hide it altogether, and that's exhausting. And this is where disenfranchised grief often overlaps with ambiguous loss. Grief where the loss is real but unclear, unresolved, or socially invisible. When someone is physically present but emotionally unavailable. When a relationship ends without closure. When a person is gone in one way but still here in another. When the loss doesn't have a clean ending or a clear beginning. Ambiguous loss leaves people suspended. You don't know how to grieve something that hasn't fully disappeared or fully existed in the way others recognize, so the grief just lingers. When grief isn't witnessed, the body learns to carry it alone, and grief carried alone often becomes inhibited, delayed, or lodged in the nervous system. People experiencing disenfranchised grief often start to doubt themselves. They ask, am I being dramatic? Do I even have the right to feel this way? But grief doesn't require permission, it requires presence. The pain doesn't come from remembering, it comes from being asked to pretend something didn't matter. And this is where shame quietly enters grief. Not because of the loss itself, but because of the way the world responds to it. Disenfranchised grief asks people to grieve without witnesses, to mourn quietly, to carry meaning without acknowledgement. And if that's you, your grief feels invisible or minimized or dismissed, I want you to hear this clearly. Your grief doesn't need validation to be real. Your pain doesn't need approval to matter. And your love doesn't disappear just because it made other people uncomfortable. Disenfranchised grief isn't something you get over. It's something that needs space, often for the first time. And this doesn't only happen after death. There's also grief that comes with becoming, not just losing. I've watched this in people I love, friends and family, mothers who grieve the loss of their identity as a single person after becoming a mom. Not because they didn't love their child, not because they regretted their life, but because something essential shifted. And we don't give people language for that kind of grief either. When grief is tied to identity change, when who you were no longer fits, but who you're becoming isn't fully formed yet, it often goes unrecognized, even by the person living it. But that grief is real, and it deserves the same care, honesty, and space as any other. The next type of grief is delayed grief, and this happens when the emotional impact of a loss doesn't arrive right away. Not because the loss didn't matter, not because you didn't love deeply, but because your system wasn't ready to feel it yet. Delayed grief often shows up after prolonged stress or crisis, periods of survival mode or environments where there was no room to fall apart, moments where you had to keep going immediately. At the time of the loss, you may have felt strangely calm, numb, focused, practical, almost okay. And people around you might have said things like, I don't know how you're so composed, you must be at peace with it. But delayed grief doesn't mean the grief wasn't there, it means it was deferred. Your nervous system prioritized getting through what was in front of you. It stored the emotional weight for later, and then sometimes months later, sometimes years, something shifts. The crisis ends, the responsibilities ease, life just slows down, and suddenly sadness shows up without warning. Grief feels sharper than expected, memories surface more vividly, or emotions feel disproportionate in the moment. People often say, I thought I already processed this, or I feel like I'm grieving out of order. Grief doesn't follow order, it follows safety. Delayed grief emerges when your body senses, I finally have enough space to feel this. This is why delayed grief often appears after returning to work or during a quiet season. Maybe around anniversaries or life transitions, or when support has faded. Maybe even when the world expects you to be back to normal. And that can be deeply confusing, especially when everyone else believed you've already moved on. Delayed grief can also carry shame, because you might tell yourself that it's been too long. But grief has no expiration date, and delayed grief isn't regression, it's arrival. It's the emotional truth catching up to a body that was busy surviving, and when delayed grief surfaces, it doesn't need to be rushed or explained away. It needs acknowledgement. So if you recognize yourself here, if grief showed up later than expected, that's okay. Your system protected you when it needed to, and now it's letting you feel what it couldn't before. There is a strong similarity between delayed grief and inhibited grief because they are both protective. One postpones feeling and the other suppresses it, but neither means the grief is gone. Another type of grief is absent grief, and this is one of the most misunderstood forms of grief. It's when there is little or no emotional response following a loss, at least on the surface. People experiencing absent grief often say, "I feel nothing. I know I should be sad, but I'm not." And this can create a lot of internal panic because people start to think, what is wrong with me? Did I not love them enough, or am I broken? But absent grief does not mean the loss didn't matter. It usually means one of three things: that the loss was expected and emotionally pre-processed, that the relationship was complicated or already mourned in other ways, or that the nervous system is still protecting itself. Absent grief is often protective. It's the mind saying, this is too much right now. I need to hold this at a distance. Sometimes absent grief stays that way. Sometimes it shifts into delayed grief. Sometimes it never looks like what we expect grief to look like at all. And that's important to say out loud, because there is no required emotional performance for grief. You don't owe tears. You don't owe devastation, and you don't owe a timeline. Absent grief isn't a failure to grieve. It's a different way the system adapts to loss. Another type of grief we have is cumulative grief, and this is what happens when losses don't come in one at a time. They come layered, overlapping, before the nervous system has had any real chance to integrate the last one. This is the kind of grief that doesn't always feel dramatic in the moment. It often feels like functioning under weight. You're still showing up, still doing what needs to be done, still moving forward, but something inside you is getting heavier, quietly. Cumulative grief isn't about one specific loss. It's about what happens when loss becomes a pattern instead of an event. A death, followed by another, followed by illness, followed by role changes, followed by responsibility, followed by another goodbye. Sometimes the losses are obvious, sometimes they're subtle. Sometimes they don't even register as grief at the time, but the body keeps count. This is where people often say things like, "I don't know why I'm so tired," or "I feel like I can't handle things the way I used to." And what they don't realize is that their system has been grieving for years without pause. Cumulative grief often shows up in people who are used to being capable, the ones others rely on, the ones who step in, the ones who hold things together. Because when you don't get time to fall apart, you also don't get time to reset. Instead, the grief layers. It compresses, it lives in the background until one day, something relatively small happens and your reaction feels out of proportion. You cry harder than you expect. You feel angrier than you should. Your body shuts down. Your tolerance disappears, and people, including you, might think, why is this going on now? But it isn't about that one moment. It's about everything that came before it. Cumulative grief also explains why some people don't feel the weight of a loss right away. They're already carrying too much. So the nervous system says, not now. We'll deal with this later, and later might be months or years or after another loss or after life finally slows down. This is why cumulative grief is often mistaken for burnout, depression, or anxiety, even nervous system dysregulation or losing resilience, when in reality it's grief without rest. Another important part of cumulative grief is that not all losses are equal, but they all count. You can be grieving the death of someone you love alongside the loss of your health, alongside the loss of a sense of safety, alongside the loss of a future you expected, or the loss of who you were before. And because these losses don't come with ceremonies or acknowledgement, they often go unmarked and unwitnessed. Cumulative grief is exhausting because it never fully resolves. It just keeps asking for space. And when it doesn't get that space, the body eventually creates it through fatigue, through illness, through emotional withdrawal, through collapse, not as failure, as protection. One of the hardest parts of cumulative grief is that people around you may not recognize it. They might say, "That was years ago. You're still standing," and while that may be true, strength doesn't mean unaffected. Cumulative grief doesn't mean you're broken. It means you've adapted again and again without enough support to fully recover in between. And healing cumulative grief doesn't happen by addressing one loss in isolation. It happens by finally acknowledging, I've been carrying more than I realized. Happens when we stop asking, why am I like this, and start asking, What has my system been holding for a long time? Cumulative grief doesn't ask you to relive everything. It asks you to honor the accumulation, to recognize your exhaustion makes sense, that your limits are earned, that your body has been doing its best to keep going. And sometimes simply naming cumulative grief, putting language to the weight, is the first moment of relief. Collective grief is another type of grief that's shared across communities, cultures, or generations. We've seen this very clearly in recent years, during the pandemic, after natural disasters, through war, violence, and displacement, amid climate loss and ecological grief. But collective grief doesn't always announce itself as grief. Sometimes it looks like widespread anxiety, anger and polarization, numbness or apathy, or chronic exhaustion. Because when grief is shared by many, it often lacks containment. There is no single ritual, no clear end, no shared language for what's been lost. And individual grief can become harder inside collective grief, because your personal pain is happening inside a larger field of suffering. People may say everyone's dealing with something, and that can unintentionally minimize personal loss. Collective grief reminds us that grief is not only personal, it's relational and societal. And without acknowledgement, it seeps into the body anyways. Prolonged grief disorder is different from the other forms we've talked about. It's not a style of grieving, it's a clinical diagnosis, and it matters how we talk about it. It's not about grief lasting too long, because grief has no expiration date. It's about grief becoming stuck in a way that significantly impairs daily functioning, long after the loss. This can include intense longing or preoccupation with the deceased, the inability to engage with life meaningfully, persistent disbelief or identity collapse, or avoidance of reminders paired with deep distress, maybe even grief that feels frozen and unchanging. What's really important to say clearly is this is not a personal failure. It's not weakness. It's not lack of effort. It often follows traumatic loss, sudden or violent death, loss without support, and loss layered with other unprocessed trauma. And it requires specialized, compassionate care, not platitudes, not pressure to move on, and not shaming. Naming progressive grief disorder is not about labeling people. It's about making room for help when grief becomes too heavy to carry alone. All of these forms of grief remind us of the same truth. Grief adapts to circumstances, bodies, and support, not rules. Most of us don't carry one kind of grief. We carry layers, and naming them isn't about labeling. It's about relief. Before we close, I want to invite you to take a breath with me. Nothing deep, nothing forced. Just a moment to let your body know this part is ending. If you recognized yourself in any of these forms of grief, especially the ones that don't have names, witnesses, or permission, I want you to remember this. You're not broken for how your grief shows up. You're not doing it wrong, and you're not alone, even if it's felt that way. Grief takes many shapes because love does. And sometimes the most important work isn't fixing it. It's finally allowing it to exist in a space where honesty and gentleness can coexist. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.